drop bears aren't real, but the legends came from somewhere. Written and narrated by Creepypasta. You ever heard of drop bears? Well, of course you have. It's probably one of the first things that springs to mind when somebody mentions Australia. Those dark, hidden creatures that drop from the branches of trees and rip you to shreds. Tourists are warned to stay away from the outback, and especially to avoid resting underneath hanging branches. I have seen something outside my living room window recently, which compels me to advise you the same. Let me take you back to the beginning and explain why. My tale begins some 20 years ago. I grew up in Richmond. No, not the one in Virginia. I'm talking about the tiny speck of dust barely visible on Google Maps that sits about 500 kilometres west of the nearest major city in Queensland, Australia. My tiny little nothing town was home to around 500 people back then, and housed little more than a school, a post office, a pub, and a little shack that sold some essential items like milk and bread and what have you. It was a rather quiet life, and that was both a blessing and a curse. Would I have preferred to have a normal childhood that looked more like movie theatres, arcades and shopping malls? Yeah, probably would have. But there's a whole lot of cool stuff I got to do that just wouldn't have been possible had I grown up in a more urban setting. Weekends spent camping, hiking, bushwalking. These are things you just don't get to do when you grow up in the cities. Or if you do, it's rare. For me, an impromptu camping trip was as easy as packing my things and walking out the door. And this, incidentally, brings us to the beginning of my tale, as that is exactly what we planned to do that fateful day. This was just a couple of weeks after my 18th birthday, and I was sitting in the back row in science class at Richmond State School, counting down the seconds to 3 p.m. It was a Friday afternoon, and I had the weekend all planned out. Hey, did you tell your dad we're going to Eric's for the weekend? I do not want my parents getting a call from anyone. My girlfriend, Emily, whispered to me from the row behind me. Yeah, so we had come up with the brilliant plan to tell our parents that we were going to go stay at our friend Eric's place for the weekend, when really, we planned to hit the bush for a 3-day campout. To be fair, this had been pretty much a foolproof plan, and had things not gone the way they did, we probably would have gotten away with it. Eric's house was kind of on the outskirts of town. Well, I say that by Aussie standards. If this town was rural, his house was in Whoop Whoop, at least an hour or so driving down a secluded dirt road. As far as our parents knew, that's where we were going to be, with plenty of other people around, in separate beds, certainly not sharing a swag together under a starlit sky. There was no mobile reception out there, so there was no way for anyone to check up on us. Yeah, don't worry about it. It's all taken care of. Eric's folks are away at the stock trade too, so no one's going to be calling anyone, I said. Emily gave me a cheeky little grin before turning back to her books. We had been dating for around a few months or so, and so far, things were going pretty well. I was quite sure about this girl. Well, as sure as you can be at that age. Startling me out of my thoughts, I felt a firm punch land on my right arm. "Dude," said Eric from beside me, "I got us a bottle of Bundy for the trip. This weekend's gonna be off the charts," he said, laughing. Eric was to be joining us on this excursion. I felt kinda bad, both for making him a third wheel and for bringing along a third wheel. I'm sure Emily and I both would have preferred a little privacy, but we needed Eric. He had recently gotten his provisional license. Em and I were both old enough to have gotten ours, but living out here in such a tiny little town with everything in walking distance, there wasn't a huge motivation to do so, especially when you had a mate who could drive you. So, as he so often was, Eric would be our designated driver this weekend. The spot we were headed was about an hour's drive down a little-known turnoff. You had to bush bash a little just to find this road. Then it was another long and rough drive from there. Finally, the school bell rang out through the halls, and we were free. I chucked my books into my bag, and along with Eric and Emily, made my way out of the building. We all rendezvoused at the south gate. "So, pick you guys up at 4, yeah?" Eric asked. "Yeah, sounds good, dude. You got all the supplies in that, yeah?" I asked him. We couldn't be seen loading camping equipment into his car in front of our parents. Luckily, Eric had everything we would need at his house. Like I said, they lived far out of town on a cattle station, so they camped out often while they were out mustering and whatnot. "Everything's in the car ready to go. Swag, Billy, grill, all of it. And that, what I said to you before, eh?" Eric said, making a drinking motion, laughing heartily as he did so. Eric had an infectious laugh, along with the absolute goofiest grin you've ever seen in your life. It was impossible not to join in with his entirely unnecessary guffawing. All right, let's not scare the lady off before this trip even gets started, eh?" I said, putting my arm around Emily. "What you talking about?" she said. "I could drink you boys under the table." "Whoa!" Eric shouted, erupting into another fit of laughter. "This one might put you to shame, mate." Yeah. Get on out of here, you dickhead. We'll see you at 4, I said, taking Emily's hand in mine and heading off down the road towards our street. Emily and I walked quietly along Crawford Street, heading back into town. I could tell that show of hers back there was a little put on. She was fairly new in town. Having grown up in Townsville, she made the move out here with her parents around a year ago. Being new, she would often say and do things she thought was, I guess, expected around these parts. I would always do my best to reassure her, let her know that I liked her for who she was, and of course I never pushed her to be anything but herself, or do anything that she didn't want to do. It had taken me quite a while to agree to this trip, for that very reason. I wanted to be sure this wasn't something she was doing to impress me. But no, she was genuinely excited for it. We reached our home street, and I gave Emily a kiss and told her we'd meet up at my place around 4 p.m. She smiled sweetly at me and made her way inside, her mum and dad giving me a wave from where they sat on the porch. They were always so nice to me. I felt a bit gross lying to them that day. But while the law may have considered me a mature adult, I was very much still a stupid teenager. The thought of a secluded weekend with my girlfriend, that was just too powerful a temptation. There was no way my conscience was winning that one. Suppressing my moral compass, I made my way up the block and across the road to my place. Dad was home, along with Eddie, his mate from the mines. Eddie was a good bloke. He was an Indigenous fellow, worked at the same mine my dad did, and he would often stay with us to save money on accommodation. It was really no burden to us. In fact, we appreciated the company, since it was just me and Dad. We were more than happy to give up one of the spare rooms when he was in town. In fact, he was here so often, that room was practically known as Eddie's room. "Heading out to Eric's, mate, eh?" asked Eddie. Yeah, just for a couple of nights, I responded. You be careful out in the scrub, mate, he said, only half jokingly. Keep an eye out for quinkins. Yeah, mate. No joke, those quinkins. Better keep your eyes open, said my dad, who simply could not help but join in on these little ribbing sessions. I just kinda half laughed, rolling my eyes and heading into my room to pack some things. Eddie was very in touch with his indigenous roots. A quinkin, for the record, is what his people believe are the spirits of the bush. They were just one of the many ghosts and monsters that he would talk about so often. Those sorts of stories, they're not exactly well known. You type it into Google, you're gonna get snippets of information spread few and far between. But as for Eddie, he knew it all. If it supposedly wandered this land at any point in history, he could tell you all about it. Personally, I preferred not to hear about such things when I was about to spend a weekend out there where these things supposedly lurked. I hurriedly threw some clothes into a bag, along with a few other necessities. Kicking back on my bed, I opened my bedside drawer, pulling out my trendy new Nokia 3315, and texting Emily that I was ready whenever she was. Just a few minutes later, I heard the door swing open, followed by Eddie's booming voice. Good to see you again, young miss, he excitedly shouted from where he sat. Emily, still rather shy around him and my dad, politely returned the greeting, not quite knowing what to say next. I chivalrously made my way out to rescue her, pack over my shoulder, ready to go. Righto, we're off, I said, taking Emily's hand in mine, and we began to walk back outside. Eddie, beer in hand and cigarette in mouth, spoke up once again. True God though, lad, you keep an eye out for this young miss. You're growing up out here. You know the land fair well by now, eh? But you watch out for her, you hear me? Eddie said, something of a serious tone in his voice now. I told him not to worry, that she's in good hands. We're just going to Eric's house anyways. Not like we're going to be bush bashing or anything, I said. He looked at me then, like he knew full well that that was a lie. You listen to Eddie, son. He knows his stuff, said my dad, and I nodded in solemn agreement, sensing that they at least had their inklings our plans were not what we were letting on. We said our goodbyes, falsely assuring them that all was fine, and stepped outside to wait for Eric. As we were waiting, I noticed Emily getting a bit quiet, and I asked her if everything was okay. What did your uncle mean? She asked me. There's nothing like dangerous out there? That's not my uncle, I said, laughing. That's just Eddie. And don't mind him. He's always on about spooky shit. Emily relaxed a bit after hearing this, but I could tell she was still keeping her guard up. This was to be her first time out in the bush. I was certainly not apathetic to this. I remembered my first time out and how scary it was. I just assured her that it was going to be fun and that we would certainly not see anything scary. A few moments later, along came Eric in his Ford Falcon station wagon. It was a beat-up old hunk of junk given to him by his parents after they'd gotten a new one a few years ago. But honestly, that made it perfect for our adventures. There's nothing better for navigating the bush than something you can beat around a bit. He pulled up out front, staring out the window with that excessively goofy grin of his. Oi, let's get going, eh? Good couple hours drive out there, he shouted. Emily and I slid into the back seat, neither of us wanting to take the front seat and leave the other sitting alone. Jesus, what am I, your chauffeur? Who's going to sit next to little old me? Said Eric, sarcastically. Hey, it's not our fault you've scared away every girl within Cooey. Probably every bloke too, I quickly retorted, getting a good laugh out of Emily. The first hour of driving went by pretty quickly. We were all in high spirits, and Emily and I had made a start on that bottle of Bundy rum, making for some fun back and forth banter. As time dragged on though, the typical boredom that comes from sitting in a car for any extended length of time began to set in. We were all just quietly looking out the window as the beauty of the outback rolled on by. We were getting pretty deep in by this stage. Anything resembling civilization had long since disappeared. It was around 5:15 when we finally rounded the bend leading up to the turnoff. It was time to head off-road. Emily cringed a bit as Eric swung off the dirt road and the spindly, dead grass screeched along the bottom of our vehicle. I could tell this was totally uncharted territory for her as she gripped my hand a bit tighter. Eric swerved quickly as a huge, big red kangaroo suddenly hopped out along our path before disappearing into the scrub. Those are the big bastards you gotta be real careful of out here. Not just on the roads, but if you're out here bushwalking and you run into one, you want to hope you startle him enough to scare him away. As otherwise, it's pretty much going to be a death sentence. They've been known to slice people clean open with those powerful legs and sharp claws. Seriously, kangaroos are not to be messed with. After a few more minutes of driving, we finally found the turnoff and we were on our way. The road from that point on was much more secluded, surrounded by thick bushland. Huge ghost gums and paperbark trees, some as tall as houses, defined the landscape out there. Their limbs hung heavy over the road, almost creating a tunnel-like effect as we drove on down. I noticed Emily looking out the window at those trees with a concerned look on her face. I gave her hand a little squeeze, letting her know everything was okay. "We've been out here a few times, babe. There's nothing to be afraid of," I said to her with a smile, which she reciprocated. "Well, that's if you don't count the drop bears," Eric said teasingly. "The what?" asked Emily. Growing up in the city, she had not been privy to such legends, even the more common ones. "Absolutely nothing. Drop bears aren't real. They're just a stupid urban legend," I said, with a tone in my voice that Eric seemed to miss entirely as he continued his teasing. "Yeah, think like koalas but bigger and with really sharp teeth. They hide up in the branches of trees just like these ones. Then, when you're right underneath them, they drop down on top of you and they rip your throat out." He made a dumb growling sound, and Emily squirmed in her seat as he did so. "Is this what Eddie was talking about?" asked Emily, a hint of concern in her voice now. "Nah, babe," I said. "He believes a whole lot of weird shit, but I've never heard him mention drop bears." "Well, they're out there," said Eric. "Seen him with my own eyes. Once when we were out mustering and another time on a camp draft. Saw him drag some poor sucker right off the trail and never saw him again." "Oh my God, stop it!" Emily spoke up, clearly a little distressed now. "Dude, come on, ease up, eh?" I said to Eric. I knew that there had been no malice in what he was doing. He was just one of those guys who tended to not know where the line was sometimes. It was somewhat of an awkward drive for the final half hour. After that outburst, we all sat in silence, not really knowing what to say to each other. But soon enough, we neared the final bend, and we caught sight of our little pocket of paradise. It was an absolutely gorgeous spot out there. Picture a yellow sand riverbank, clear blue flowing water with plenty of fish, and a little alcove surrounded by those beautiful ghost gums and paperbarks. Their branches stretched out at just the right angles to provide shade at all hours of the day. Eric cruised on down, coming to a stop near to a relatively flat patch of land. "Should be a good spot to set the swags up, eh?" asked Eric, and I answered in the affirmative. Emily had clearly forgotten about the drop bear comment earlier, and she looked proper excited now. It was clear that that had really been her first time out. We all jumped out and started unpacking our things excitedly. "Where's our tent?" asked Emily. Eric and I looked at each other and chuckled. I said nothing, instead just reaching into the dog box and pulling out a rolled up swag. "This is our tent," I said, looking at her with a smirk on my face. If you're as unfamiliar as Emily was to the concept of an Aussie swag, it's basically just a mattress with a really, really small cover attached. I guess you could call it a small tent, at a stretch maybe, but the cover is honestly just big enough to maybe fit a very, very small pack in there with you. I laid the swag out, unrolling it and popping up the cover. As I got to work hammering in tent pegs, Emily swaggered on over, walking around the swag and inspecting it. She crossed her arms and looked down at me. That's very cozy," she said, looking at me with an accusing look on her face. I just smiled back at her, not even bothering to deny anything. It was nearing around 6:30 by this stage, so as soon as we had everything set up, we got some dinner going and began to settle in for the night. Dinner was to be a luxurious dining experience consisting of Heinz baked beans, Tom Piper canned sausages, and to top it all off, tinned sauerkraut. Honestly though, it's amazing how tasty terrible food becomes when you're out there roughing it. After dinner, we all sat around the fire toasting marshmallows for dessert. Emily's eyes went wide as she lowered the marshmallow on the end of her stick into the flames and it caught on fire, and Eric and I both burst out laughing as she squealed, frantically trying to blow it out. "What'd you think was gonna happen?" I asked, through tears of laughter. "I don't know. I thought it would just heat up a little bit," she shot back, laughing along with us, but clearly a bit embarrassed. And so the night went on. Tears were shed, stories were told, and laughter was shared. Sitting there under the starry moonlit sky, knowing we were just existing there together, in one of the most isolated places on the face of the earth, was absolutely beautiful. Eventually, we all started getting a bit tired, and our spirits began to mellow. As we sat there around the fire, passing the bottle of Bundy to one another, Eric started getting very quiet. "What's wrong with you?" I asked, kinda jokingly. "This is maybe one of the last times we'll ever be doing this," he answered, a little sadness in his voice. "Jesus, dude, no one's dying," I said back, trying to lighten the mood back up. "Nah, man, I mean, this is our senior year, you know? It feels like everything's coming to an end. How many times we've done this, you and me, eh? It's always been so much fun, because we knew there was always a next time. I don't know, man. Just feels like we're running out of next times." Eric trailed off softly. I must admit, that did hit me a little, hearing him say that. It was such a bittersweet metaphor to life. How many of those next times do we really have? How would we do things differently if we knew? "We'll probably never see each other again, you know?" Eric wasn't done yet. "Mum and Dad will make me partner on the station, and you, well, you got a serious girlfriend now. You guys will probably go off and do your own thing. There won't be time to visit each other. Just feels like everything's moving so fast now." I saw Emily's head turn toward me out of the corner of my eye, and I turned to face her. She was smiling at me. "Serious girlfriend?" she asked. I clammed up a little, unsure of what to say. "Oh, come on," said Eric, looking at me from across the fire. "I've known you for years. Never seen you like this with anyone. I'll bet my life you two are still together in 10 years' time." Emily shifted over a little closer to me. and I put my arm around her. I gently kissed her and pulled her close to me. "You know what, dude?" I said, smiling at Emily as the fire crackled away in the night. "I think there's plenty more next times ahead of us." Eric rolled his eyes before getting up and letting out an exaggerated yawn. "I'm going to bed before you lovebirds make me puke," he said, heading over to his swag. "Yeah, that's totally us, right? Not at all because you can't hold your Bundy," I shot back at him, giving him a teasing little wink. Whatever, dude. Alright, see us in the morning, eh? Watch out for them drop bears, Em," Eric said, sporting that stupidly eccentric grin of his, before crawling into his swag and zipping it up. "Drop bears aren't real, dickhead," I shouted back at him, more for Emily's sake than my own. Emily and I sat by the fire a bit longer, just enjoying the peace and quiet. We talked back and forth a while, reflecting on the earlier conversation. She continued to subtly quiz me on Eric's serious girlfriend remark, of course, and I deflected as best I could, as any typical young man tends to do. Deep down though, I think we both knew what Eric had said was true. The hours ticked on by, and eventually, we decided it was time to get some sleep. I flicked on my little battery-powered lantern, grabbed a bucket of water from the river, and doused the fire, the flames sizzling out with a resounding hiss. We both made our way over to our shelter for the night. I unzipped the entrance, hung our little light source up on the roof of the swag, and we climbed on in. We got all snuggled up and comfy, and before long, as the wind quietly whistled through the ghost gums outside and the cicadas sung their sweet lullabies, we were off to sleep in each other's arms. I awoke with a start to the sound of the swag being unzipped. I spun around quickly to find Emily. "Shh, relax. I was just taking a piss," she whispered. Oh yeah, she was starting to talk like a proper country girl by this stage. Bloody scared me. Not exactly the kind of sound you want to wake up to out here, I said, laughing a little. "Sorry," she said, also snickering a bit. "Oh my god, it's so nice out here though." "Yeah, it sure is," I said, as she snuggled back up in my arms. "We could do this more often, you know." "That'd be nice," she said, smiling. "I'd love to see more of the bush out here. I must admit though, I find the stories a little disturbing." I laughed. "What, like the drop bears? You know that stuff's not real, right?" "I know," she said, "but Eddie sure seems to think there's something to it." "Eddie believes a lot of quirky shit," I reassured her. "Hang around him long enough and he'll have you believing all sorts of scary stories. Then you'll never want to come back out here." She laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess so. Anyway, I think it would be..." Emily stopped mid-sentence, the sound of rustling leaves above us giving her pause. "Babe, seriously, don't sweat it. Nothing's out here. It's just the wind." "Okay," she trailed off. "But I swear I could..." She was cut off again, this time by my hand clasping firmly over her mouth and pulling her tightly up close to me. That time, I had heard something that actually did cause me alarm. There is a big difference out there between the typical sounds of the bush, which may startle those who aren't used to them, and sounds that really should be paid attention to. After many trips out there, from hiking with Dad as a kid to camping with my friends in my teen years, I had learned to tell that difference. What I heard in that moment was not a few leaves rustling in the wind. It was the sound of feet, scratching along the branches above us. Paws, or maybe something clawed, was moving slowly but surely around up there. Emily began shaking, and I knew she had caught on to the seriousness of the situation. "Shh," I said. "Try not to move." You must understand, I had seen all manner of bush animals. I'd pretty much seen it all. Dingoes, wild pigs, roos, crocs. If it lives out there, I've encountered it in one way or another. But I had never in my life heard of or seen an animal that walks along the thick branches of a paperbark tree with such weight upon it that it causes the branch to begin physically creaking. That is what we heard as we lay there in that little swag. The sounds of the branches above us creaking, straining under the weight of something taking very deliberate steps. "You told me drop bears weren't real," Emily whispered through tears. "Shh," I said again. "They're not. I mean, they can't be," I stammered in response, trying to keep as quiet as possible. And then we heard another sound, a zipper, from the swag on the other side of the camp. I felt Emily jolt suddenly as she instinctively tried to get up to warn Eric. I tightened my firm grip on her. There was nothing we could do. If there was something out there capable of hurting Eric, how did it make sense to put us in danger too? We had no choice, right? We heard more footsteps from above, making their way out along one of the branches. We could hear fingers or toes or whatever it possessed softly patting down upon the paperbark as it crept its way along. We heard Eric crawl out of his swag. We heard him stand up and yawn. We heard the sound of something slip off the paperbark above. We heard what would be Eric's last words. "What the fuck?" We heard those words trail into a scream for but a mere moment. And then we heard something land with a thud. My grip once again tightened around Emily as she descended into full-blown panic mode. She desperately tried to struggle, her fight or flight instinct no doubt kicking in. We could hear muffled groans and the sound of a person kicking and struggling in the dirt outside. I shut my eyes and I carefully pulled a blanket over Emily and I as I heard the sound of something slurping and gurgling, sounds that I had never, ever heard out there before. After many long minutes on end, listening to those noises, all went quiet. We lay there for ages as time ticked by into the early hours of the morning. At any moment, expecting to see something appear before the entrance to our swag. But nothing came. After many long hours lying there, I chanced to look outside. I slowly, carefully unzipped the swag and poked my head out. I very quickly retreated and placed my hand on Emily's shoulder. "Please don't scream," I whispered to her. "Something is still out there." It sat hunched by Eric's swag, just sitting there in the moonlight, gently rocking back and forth. We could do nothing but lay there, all through the night. As the sun crept its way across the sky early in the morning, still, we heard no movement in the camp. We lay there for hours and hours into the next day, Emily occasionally breaking into silent sobs, her tears trickling down across my arm. The sun was burning high in the sky by this stage. This was nearing on the summer months, and we were getting dangerously close to heat stroke underneath that blanket. It wasn't until maybe 3 in the arvo that we finally heard movement. Something big was dragging itself away. We then heard the sound of something splash into the nearby river, and the soft sounds of water swishing and swirling, as though something was awkwardly swimming across. The river was not all that wide, yet it seemed to take forever for these splashing sounds to cease. Finally, we heard that dragging noise again, continuing across the barren earth on the other side. It was then we heard a sound that I will never be capable of erasing from my memory, no matter how hard I have tried over the years. Among the silence of the outback, we heard these disgusting, burping, regurgitating sounds echoing out over the land. For minutes on end this went on, as if something were trying to forcibly belch out its own intestines. Still to this day, I feel sick as I vividly recall those sounds in my head. And that was that. This excruciatingly prolonged vomiting suddenly came to an abrupt halt, followed by the sounds of footfalls rapidly disappearing off into the distance. That would be the last we ever heard of that particular nightmare. It felt like forever that we were laying in that swag. We were both too afraid to come out, terrified that something might be sitting there waiting for us. It was well into the evening, maybe 6 p.m. or so, when we heard the crunch of tires, followed by an engine shutting off and car doors opening and closing. Footsteps, 2 pairs of them, made their way around the campsite before coming to a stop right in front of our swag. We looked up to see Dad, and we both scrambled out of that swag, frantically yelling and screaming about monsters, telling him we needed to get the hell out of there. "Where's young Eric?" I heard Eddie's voice from the other side of the camp, standing by our friend's now empty swag. We just looked at him, tears in our eyes, Emily screaming about drop bears. Eddie just looked off into the trees, shaking his head. Eric's parents had come home early, you see. Finding no trace of him at home, calls were made. When Dad and Eddie discovered that we were in fact not staying at Eric's place all weekend, they narrowed it down, knowing we'd come to one of our favourite camping spots. We all made our way back home in silence. There were police inquiries, and of course, Eric's disappearance was treated with the highest suspicion. But we were just stupid kids. Dad had money, and we had the best legal representation said money could buy. Eddie stopped coming around. I suppose Dad didn't want him putting ideas in my head, or perpetuating ones that were already there. Our babblings of monsters and cryptids went no further than the lawyers, who swiftly told us to shut the hell up about it, unless we wanted to see the inside of an institution. And so we did. Until many years later, that is. You see, my story doesn't end there, all those years ago. Eric had been right about one thing. Emily and I were meant to be. All these years later, we share a home and a life together, settling down in our own house, on our own little patch of land, a little ways drive out of town. We never felt quite right about the idea of leaving, so we never did. I followed my dad into the mines, and Emily got a job teaching at Richmond State. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a phenomenon. Something about what Eric said to us that night, the last time we ever spoke to him. His speech about how he's going to be stuck here while Emily and I move on and live our lives. Those words burrowed their way into our subconscious. We never could bring ourselves to move out of that shithole of a town. Why should we get to move on when Eric never will? After many years of suppressing those memories at the advice of our legal team, and of course our parents, who didn't want the embarrassment of supposedly mentally unstable kids, it is only recently that these memories began to truly resurface, and I made a call to an old friend. Eddie and I met up at the Mud Hut Hotel in town one Friday evening, and as we got to talking, I gently eased into the subject of monsters and legends. Mate, this is gonna sound bizarre, even for you, but is there any truth to the drop bears thing? Is that something that's talked about among your people? I asked him, before taking a sip of my beer. Eddie just laughed. Nah, brother, no such thing. That's a white fella story, that one. I took another swig of my beer, wondering whether I really wanted to go down this path of conversation. That night, I started. Yeah, I know what happened that night, mate. Eddie interrupted me. I turned and looked at him, the look in my eyes clearly asking him to continue. Ain't no such thing as a drop bear, but all legends stem from somewhere, you know, he said. Few critters my people know of that live in the trees like that. Most harmless, but one of them, far from it. I spoke up at this point. We heard something drop down from the tree that night. I could never forget it, Eddie. They all told me to shut up and not talk about it, but I could never forget those sounds. I know, brother, I know. And you got a right to know what happened to your mate out there. Only one thing I know of that'll do that. We call it the Yarama Yahoo. Name sounds a bit silly, but don't let that fool you. This fella's no fun at all. But I'm sure you know that, said Eddie, with a serious tone in his voice now. I've never even heard of it, I answered. Not many have, mate, Eddie continued. It's like the vampire of our land. I guess would be the closest white fella comparison. But totally different look. He's a chubby little one. Thick, sometimes hairy. He'll drop down from the tree, and before you can get so much of a scream out, he's already got you in his mouth. I thought back to that night, that thud we heard, as something dropped from above. You sure you want to hear the rest, mate? Asked Eddie, clearly sensing some discomfort. Yeah, go on, I said. It wasn't really out of any need to hear anymore. I suppose it was just morbid curiosity by that stage. Well, the Yarama Yahoo, he slowly start to eat you then. Little chomps at a time, you know. He ain't got no sharp teeth or nothing. It's a bit like a snake, I suppose, when he's chowing down on his prey. He'll just sit there, slowly eat you up. Don't matter how you struggle. Once he's got you, no getting away. I thought back to those groans, slurps and gurgles as Eric struggled helplessly around. After he gobble you up, this fella, he's just gonna sit there and digest you for a while. After that, he's gonna find a nice shady spot to belt you up. Then, you just kinda sit there for a few days, in a state of limbo. You're just a mess of guts and innards by then, but you'll be conscious through it all. Slowly, you start to reform, After that, you come back to life. Not as you were, though. Nah, brother. Now, you're one of his kind. You'll wander the land forever, as one of them. I thought back to those awful vomiting noises we heard. My God, could it be true? The conversation trickled on along similar lines from there. It was a lot to take in. I admit, I was still skeptical, despite what I knew full well I had heard that night. I guess it was just too awful a fate for me to comprehend. The idea that not only was Eric's death not quick and not at all painless, but the thought of the Yorama Yahoos' victims never knowing peace. It was too much to take in, too much to carry. My mind refused to accept it. We finished our beers, said our goodbyes, and I made my way back home. Which brings us to now. You may be wondering what prompted me to get in touch with Eddie after all these years. Well, it is because I believe I have seen the very thing he described to me that night. One look at it, and I knew there was only one man to talk to. It was a quiet night, just a couple of weeks ago. Emily and I were sitting in our living room, having dinner, when all of a sudden, we heard a strange sound. One we had not heard in almost 20 years, rustling its way up one of the branches outside our second-story window. Something was perched on the branch, hunched over and staring inside at us. It was short, thick, and chubby. It was grinning the absolute goofiest grin you've ever seen in your life.